Hello, and welcome to another episode of the AnxietyRX Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Russell Kennedy, author of two books on anxiety, The Anxiety Prescription and AnxietyRX, as well as your mind-body prescription for permanent anxiety healing, a online program called MBRX. And today on the program, I am opting in to Meg Doll, her podcast, because she did a podcast with me about eating disorders and anxiety. Meg is a eating disorder specialist, and she counsels people with eating disorders because Meg herself had an eating disorder and found her way out and now helps other people find their way out too. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. It's a little echoey, but the conversation itself is wonderful. So I hope you enjoy.
I am so excited to have you with me today. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Russ.
Thank you, Meg.
I am really excited to chat about anxiety with you today. And I know, you and I first met during our SEP certification. So, we have that in common. But you and I were both just talking a little bit before I hit record about kind of our outlook on things and understanding about anxiety. And we have such similar views. So I'm so excited for you to share with our audience today and chat about that. So do you want to, whenever I have a guest on, I like rolling it back a little bit and just for you to share with everyone how you got into the field.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was born a poor student son in 1960. No, I was born in 1960. My father was bipolar and schizophrenic. So I grew up in this environment where I never really knew when he was going to go off. And it was never abusive or violent, but psychosis, especially when you're a child and you see your father go full-blown psychotic, thinking he's Jesus or whatever, it's very disturbing for a child. And especially because when he would come back to me, he'd be such a loving, caring, intelligent, playful guy. And then all of a sudden, I would just lose him to horrible depression or mania where he's up four days in a row without sleeping. So that kind of forged my own alarm system, because I like to call anxiety a state of alarm, because that's really what it is. Things like OCD, eating disorders, anxiety, depression, all come from this state of alarm, which usually forms in childhood and usually is from some form of separation. So for me, it was separation from my dad. My mom was great. My mom was, she was at RN. She was British, so, Scottish. So she was kind of stiff upper lip, not really a whole lot of emotional closeness or connection, but, she'd, go to her death for you. She made sure that we had food and housing and all that kind of stuff. But there wasn't a whole lot of closeness as far as affection goes. My dad was so much more affectionate than my mother. So when I would lose my dad, there was this thing in me that says, well, what did I do? What did I do to create this? Because there's this great saying that says when you abuse, neglect, or abandon a child, the child doesn't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves.
Right.
And that's when the negative self-talk comes in. And then what we were talking about just before we started was sometimes these negative self-talks can work in the brain where the brain reacts with giving you feel-good chemicals because it's trying to help you feel better. But that can be addictive. So you wind up creating this negative self-talk and then repeating that negative self-talk because on some level, we're rewarded for negative self-talk. We're rewarded for treating ourselves badly because the brain says, okay, we're in a crisis. Here's these chemicals that make us feel better. And unfortunately, that just creates the behavior, ingrains the behavior even more. So it's a matter of understanding that most anxiety, depression, eating disorders, OCD, to some extent personality disorders, come from the state of alarm in our bodies that was pushed down because our little minds couldn't handle it at the time. Now that's a big opening, but that's basically kind of what I talk about.
Yeah, it's huge. And I mean, negative self-talk is something that obviously so many of my clients deal with. And as you know, I work a lot with the eating disordered eating population. And so obviously that's something that we really work on, but traditional, and this is something else we were talking about before we hit record, but traditional approaches to anxiety or traditional approaches to eating disorder recovery, they're just not working, right? Because we do approach it as this mental thing. and we have to like change the way we think, where it goes like so much deeper than that. And it's like in the body versus the mind.
Yeah. So that's what I think. I think what happens is that when we're children, we experience a trauma that's too much for our little minds to bear. So what it does is, and Freud called it suppression or repression or whatever term you want to use. So the brain and the body sort of take that trauma and they stuff it into our body, and to give the mind a little more freedom to work. And it gets stuck there. And then that creates the state of alarm, physiological alarm, survival in our body. And then our brains read that physiological alarm. But because we're much better at describing things verbally than how things feel, we start believing our thoughts. We start believing that our worries are the cause of the problem, when it's actually the state of alarm that was stuck in our bodies years and years ago that created this separation from ourselves, which creates more alarm. So you get into this snowball effect of creating more alarm. And then you get this poor child growing up, and they try to find ways of soothing that alarm. And one of those ways is OCD. You know, one of those ways is eating disorder. One of those ways is anxiety. And I think sometimes even gender dysphoria is a way of kind of making sense of the alarm, this sort of existential alarm that they feel in their body, because they don't know how to explain it. So we want a little package we can put it into. Okay, I have this. This is my issue, right? And then that issue just gets magnified over the course of time because it does make sense to our cognitive brains, but we're actually chasing our tails because it's not the actual cause of the problem.
Right. Yeah. So while we're on that topic, like, how do you even feel about labels of things? Like, yeah.
Well, the DSM, I think, is helpful for clinicians to talk to other clinicians. It gives you a snapshot of what you deal with. But if you look at, say, anxiety, you know, sort of pressure of speech, fast heart rate, sweating, all this kind of stuff, they have these 9 criteria for anxiety. And it's a smorgasbord. It's like a Costco list. Like it's not something that's organized. It happens in some people. It doesn't happen in others. So the DSM, in a way, is just this label of all these things that come from the same source. It's all coming from the state of alarm, and different people have predispositions to different things. And that's why it shows up. For me, it showed up as anxiety because that was my predisposition. I was predisposed to anxiety. If you're predisposed to OCD, if you have a family history of OCD, when you get really stressed and the alarm gets too high, you will probably lean into OCD. If you have family history or eating disorders is kind of your quote unquote thing, when you get stressed, that's what's going to come up, right? And then because on some level, we are rewarded almost for hurting ourselves because the brain has to make these endorphins and kephalins, the runner's high chemicals, right? The endogenous opiates opioids that we have. So when we create trauma for ourselves, our brain tries to help us by creating these chemicals. But what it winds up doing is making us addicted and reaffirming the diagnosis that we already have, right? So, and then when we get stressed, we're much more likely to flow back into that. So I don't know what the case with you, but when I would deal with my anxiety or my eating disorder patients, when they were fine unless they had a breakup or a parent got sick or whatever. And then that groove we all have something, right? Then that groove just comes up to the surface again. And because our brains reward us for that in this really screwed up way, that's the path we'll go down, because we're looking for any kind of help, because a lot of these issues started when we were 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, 12 years old, whatever. So I always say that all emotional overreactions are age regressions. So if you go through this traumatic period, you're going to regress back. So when you're talking to your partner or whatever, when you get regressed back to an 8-year-old, and then your partner regresses back to an 8-year-old, you have 2 8-year-olds fighting with each other, and it's not going to go well. So my point in that is that we all have these natural kind of grooves, I believe, that we fall into. Mine was anxiety. I could have gone depressed. I could have gone that way. I didn't, though. But it wasn't a conscious choice. It was just that's how I grooved. I grooved into this sort of anxiety mold. So that's how it shows up with me. And whatever your predisposition is, when you get stressed, you will naturally default into that place, because that's the path of least resistance.
Right. But that's really not like a life sentence.
No, of course not.
Because Yeah. So speaking about these grooves, okay. So my first eating disorder was when I was 10.
Okay.
And then I recovered and was like actually like fully recovered, never thought about an eating disorder. But then 5 years later, my grandpa passed away and I relapsed into the exact same type of eating disorder. And it took me such a long time to actually get out of that one. And it wasn't until I started tending to like childhood trauma and younger versions of myself, right? Doing somatic experiencing and internal family systems work that now, since like 2019, I would say like I'm so solid in my recovery. And that didn't come from the traditional eating disorder stuff. And I've gone through a lot of stressful times in my life since 2019.
Right.
And that's why I'm like, I'm so solid because I haven't fallen back into that.
Does it come up though,
Right.
Meg? As it sort of in the back of your mind, is it like, here's something that I used to do that, and does it come up for you? Like,
What?
can you just are able to kind of go, nah,
What comes up actually is these moments of like, whoa, this is so cool that I get to do this now. So it's not like, ooh, I could do this, right? Like, oh, maybe I should skip a meal. And that's why I say I'm so solid, because for me, I did have so many years when I wasn't engaging in the behavior, but I would have all these thoughts, right? Like, oh, I could just like skip this snack, or oh, I'm hungry, but I ate this yesterday. So I'm, having all
Yeah,
of
sure.
these thoughts.
Yeah.
But to me, that was kind of when I was in like what we call like quasi recovery, right? Like we're recovered, but not like fully recovered. And now I don't have those thoughts, but it's more these moments of experiencing life and being like, whoa, this is so cool that I can just eat and not think about these things. It's like these like very cool eye-opening experiences, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you when we first started talking was, you said this started when you were 10 years old. Was there a precipitating event to that?
Yeah, so a death in the family.
Okay.
Like first family member to actually that I was close to that passed away. It was kind of like a grandfather figure in my life. And at that time I was kind of being like bullied in school, already suffering with like low self-esteem, bad body image issues. Body image has always been a thing for me. And then that death happened and I went into like an eating disorder.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I mean, is that was your group. Like you had already it was already sort of set in you that's kind of your brain said, okay, well, this is a way, because so much of OCD, eating disorders, is a dissociation, right? So we have this alarm that comes up in our system. We don't want to deal with it because it's uncomfortable and it's a version of our younger selves that we don't want to deal with. So instead, we get more of something concrete that we can hang on to. OCD is a classic example. It's like, okay, I'll tap the window 5 times before I open it or whatever. And it does, in the brain, it does actually work, but it only works for about 0.4 seconds. And then you have to keep doing it. That's why OCD rituals get so elaborate, because you have to keep adding on to them for them to have that same sort of pain relieving quality. So there is, and that's the thing, and that's the whole thing about addiction, is you can't get enough of what you don't want. So this thing is, you learn, okay, if I restrict this, or if I learn how to sort of, kind of punish myself in a way, I do get these sort of feel-good chemicals in my head. It never comes to an amount that it actually does allow me to feel good over the long course of the time, which is why it becomes addictive. It's just the same thing about drinking. Like when you first drink, it stimulates your GABA receptors in your brain. So the GABA receptors are the ones that cause inhibition, cause relaxation, but they gum them up. So they kind of stick them up for 48 hours. So now even just normal things don't make you happy anymore. So you have to keep, this is why people keep drinking, because they're trying to chase that sort of initial GABA relaxation that the alcohol gave them. And it does, for some extent, if you keep drinking, it will sort of boost it up a little bit and kind of have an easing effect on your system. But then about 90 minutes into it, it starts this activation, and then you have to drink more to kind of keep ahead of that activation. So our brains are really, they rule our lives in so many ways, unless we have awareness. Once we have awareness, like, okay, I know that if I go down this path, I'm going to wind up snowballing, right? So then you can choose at that point. But if it depends on how young you were when it started and how emotionally volatile your particular brain is, because some of us are much more sensitive than others. So we're more susceptible to, if you're sensitive, you're much more susceptible to all the sort of things, eating disorders, OCD, depression, anxiety, all that stuff. So it's really important that you see the road ahead. And the earlier you see this is where I'm going, the more you can take an exit off of it. As opposed to if you just sort of blindly go, well, I'll just do this. I'll just skip this meal. I'll just, it'll be okay. Then the farther down that road you go, the harder it is to get off that road.
Oh, totally.
Yep.
Like skip one meal
Yep.
and the next one is easier to skip and then the next one's easier. Yeah.
Yeah, like we were talking about before, is like there's a part of our brain called the ventromedial hypothalamus, which kind of makes us hungry. Now, and I was thinking about this, I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, but I imagine there is some sort of cognitive way to start overriding that hunger, that initial hunger response, so that you can actually go into an eating disorder. I'd like to have done a little more research before, we talk, but I knew we would just talk about everything. So it's fine. But I'm always really interested in the neurology behind, anxiety and the amygdala, eating disorders and the hypothalamus, all this, how does it all work? And how can we create more effective treatments based on that knowledge of neuroscience, as well as the spiritual stuff, of course, where you connect with yourself, which is where the alarm comes from in the first place.
Yeah. So why don't we talk more about like the spiritual stuff,
Sure.
right? Because so we've been talking about this alarm, and I think for most people, when this alarm comes up or their anxiety comes up, that response is, oh no, I need to get rid of this.
Totally.
Right? I have so many clients coming my way and they tell me, well, I have anxiety. And they basically come to us being like, help me get rid of this anxiety. But obviously that's not our approach, is to try and just get rid of it. So let's talk about that and just how like the spiritual aspect of that kind of comes in as well, how you bring that in.
Yeah, because I think what happens is that we have this child that lives in us. And if that child is given secure attachment and support, we grow into what I call our authentic selves, the person that we're supposed to be. Now, if we get a lot of trauma, and as I was saying before, if we're really sensitive to start with, and there's trauma there, we learn that life is about survival. And we develop this reactive self. So this is where, people pleasing usually starts with trying to control a parent's behavior or look after a parent. And it works because the parent says, oh, you're so wise for your age. You help me so much. And, the kid's like 8 years old and the parent is depending on the child. And then the child gets some sort of reinforcement from that, some sort of dopamine boost from that. It's like, oh, I'm important. I'm really important. Mom thinks I'm important because I can look after her. And that becomes a pattern in your brain. It's like, oh, I'll help other people. And you become this reactive people pleaser. And then the more you go down that path, the more you lose who you really are. You may be a very compassionate, kind person, and you probably are. And then you wind up that goes overboard, because you get some positive feedback from a parent and in some sense of control over your environment. So then you become this reactive self. And then you have to move back to your authentic self before you can really heal from anything. And that's really finding that child in you. And I have this thing I call should mnemonic or acronym. So it's see, hear, open to, understand, love, and defend.
Okay.
The child that's in you, right? And that's really where it comes from. So for me, being an anxiety specialist, I see anxiety and OCD and eating disorders in the same kind of realm as a disconnection of your adult self today from your child self of yesterday, because you don't want to go back to that child because that child holds all your pain. And the child is like, I don't trust adult you because you've left me alone for so long with my pain. So that divide just gets greater and greater. The alarm gets greater and greater. And the symptoms created by that alarm, whether, it be OCD, eating disorders, anxiety, depression, those symptoms magnify in a way to say, hey, I have a child who's alarmed, who needs the adult in me to come back and find me.
Yeah.
That's why the alarm. So when people say, I want to get rid of my anxiety, it's like, well, you're basically saying, I want to shut the child in me that's hurt away in a closet. And that, of course, it does actually work initially because you can defend. But over time, that child comes up and it gets louder and louder and louder. And then the anxiety, the alarm is what we're really dealing with. Alarm. Anxiety is just the manifestation. Eating disorders are just the manifestation. OCD is just the manifestation of this alarm, this internal separation that's creating all this stuff. So to heal this in a spiritual way, we have to connect our adult self with our child self, and we have to connect our mind and our body. And this is where like yoga, Tai Chi, all that kind of stuff, that comes in. So if we can connect our mind and our body together, and we can connect the adult self with the child self and pull them both together, pull everything together, then we stand the best chance of healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really like that you brought in like the aspect of trust. That was a huge thing for me. We often hear so much about like this need for control when it comes to eating disorder recovery. But for me, it was like once I started seeing it as this like younger part of me inside that was like hurting or anxious or feeling a certain way, it was more of this understanding that this younger part of me actually didn't trust me to make decisions around food. So that was like a big spiritual component of my healing, is really understanding that this younger version of me really lacked this sense of trust, and healing that trust with myself.
Yeah, and that's why I tell people, if you can have a picture of yourself at the age where, for you might be 10 years old, and put it up on your bathroom mirror, and just, you don't have to, sometimes people talk to it. I think that's helpful, but just acknowledging that part of you, like unconsciously every day, going by, you're going in to have a pee. It's like, hey, how's it going, Maggie? Or whatever, and if you had a childhood nickname, like I use Rusty, right? Like that was my childhood nickname. So whenever I, go to my picture, I also have a picture of myself when I'm 3 as my screensaver on my phone. So, and my book is all about, me connecting to Rusty. It has a lot of neuroscience and a lot of reasons why alarm creates all these problems. But it's really fundamentally about how to go back to yourself and find that younger version of you. Because there's a lot of resistance to go in there, because we don't want to go back to that place where we're a child. It's powerless. It's so excruciatingly painful to be a child, to have so much uncertainty in your childhood environment and be powerless to do anything about it, that we never want to go back there. But the catch-22 is, if we don't go back there, we never actually heal. We develop coping strategies which help us cope, but we don't actually heal. And I think that's what traditional allopathic treatment, psychology, psychiatrists, they help you cope. They have all these cognitive strategies that help you cope, but they're really just, I draw this analogy of being in a rowboat, having a hole in the hull of the boat. It's filling up the water. The water is the anxiety, and you can bail water, which is basically kind of managing your thoughts and stuff. But unless you go down and you patch that hole in the hull of the boat, which is basically find a child, feel the alarm, patch the hole, you're always going to be bailing water.
Yeah.
You're always going to be coping instead of healing.
Yeah. That's kind of like, just to bring it to like an example with eating disorder recovery, right? I spent so many years working with a dietitian, being handed meal plans, and that works great and all. But then when you're out in the real world, it's like, what do I do without a meal plan? And that causes all sorts of anxiety, and you literally don't know what to do without this meal plan. So what you and I do are actually like supporting the client to like heal that younger part
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, and for anxiety, taking medication for anxiety, it's like Seinfeld. Not there's anything wrong with that, but it basically does the same thing. It helps you cope, and it almost dangles you over the gates of hell in a way, because it gives you something where you can just maintain your anxiety, where you can cope with it, but you don't really actually want to go in and heal it. And that was one of my problems with giving people antidepressants, was that it would take away the initial symptoms, whether or not it be anxiety, eating disorders, OCD. It would take away the symptoms. And then once the symptoms were gone, they thought, well, I don't want to have to really go in and heal this younger part of me because I feel better. And one of the things I used to notice all the time about the SSRI medications was that people would say, I don't have the OCD anymore, but I don't feel much of anything.
Right.
Right? I know I'm not depressed anymore.
It's like the flatness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So given, you know, being horribly suicidally depressed and being flat, people will pick flat. And after you've been on a medication for so long, people get used to living in that sort of flat environment. They don't really know what it's like to live. And that in and of itself kind of keeps them locked in their old behaviors because they're afraid to try something new because they're in this sort of, you know, tentative, like, well, I feel better, you know, life still isn't great, but I feel better. So this is better than where I was.
Yeah, I can relate. I
Oh,
was
yeah.
on
Me too.
antidepressants for a long time,
too.
and it's like just not feeling anything.
But sometimes it's life-saving. I mean, sometimes, you know, when someone's suicidal, even though some of the SSRIs actually have suicidal tendencies in people, but sometimes it can be life-saving because when you're at that wall where you're suicidal and, you know, you turn right and that's an abhorrent choice, you turn left, there's no way out. And the problem, and I tell people that too, because I've been in those situations a few times in my life. It's like, there is a way out, but you just can't see it at that point, right? Because, you know, my life is immeasurably better. Like I'm in my 60s now, and this is the happiest I've ever been, right?
That
So,
makes me so happy.
yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about mind-body connection, and I want to go back to that because so many of us are living in our minds. So what are some of your favorite practices that like kind of brought that connection in for you?
Yeah, there's, you know, just touch. You know, you can only have sensation in the moment, right? So one of the things that I talk about in the book is developing this mantra, which is sensation without explanation. So the alarm is there, you know, and some people will have it in their solar plexus, like me. Some people it's in their heart, some people it's in their throat, some people it's in their belly. But finding that sensation and being able to stay with the discomfort of that sensation without going into your coping strategies and just breathing into it, putting like sensation is so important. Breath is so important. Just being and just feeling your feet on the ground, just being able to be in sensation. Because when you're in sensation, you're not in the future worries because you're in the present moment. And you're not in your past pain either. Even though you may be in present moment pain because the alarm is painful, but you're actually doing something to mend the hole in the hull of the boat when you actually have sensation. You find the alarm. This is what Cynthia does too. She allows people to find that feeling of alarm and we acclimatize to it. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which most of us know. And Bessel van der Kolk in that book says, you know, we're not teaching people how to get rid of their alarm or their anxiety. We're teaching them how to acclimatize to the sensation so they don't have to dissociate into all the stories of their mind so that you can actually handle it. And it's like, well, this is uncomfortable because I still get anxious or alarmed, I should say. But it's like I sit there with it. It's like, I know it's going to pass. It's uncomfortable. I don't like it. But I can actually see the compulsion of my mind to start to worry because that was a coping strategy. That was what happened. And this is what I believe starts anxiety is that you have this alarm in your system from childhood wounds that aren't resolved that creates a physiology in your body that is of survival. And your brain will start giving you all sorts of thoughts that are consistent with how your body feels. So if your body feels great, your brain will give you great thoughts. If your body feels like it needs to survive, it will give you all these thoughts and confirm. And, you know, it reminds me of that Brene Brown quote where she says, you know, don't go looking for reasons why you don't belong because you'll always find them.
You'll always find out.
And don't go looking for reasons why you're in danger because you'll always find it. So, you know, deal with the actual root of the problem, which is this state of alarm in your body. That's where you're going to heal from. Changing your thinking, becoming more aware is really important, but it's not going to heal you. It's a first step that we all have to do before we can heal. But finding that mind-body connection for yourself, where you start looking at yourself in a benevolent way. And I know how Pollyanna and sort of woo-woo this sounds, but it's
There's
just
nothing too woo-woo.
yeah. Okay. All right. There we go. There we go. So, and just be, you know, keep that self-talk compassionate to yourself and practice it. And this is why I say, have that picture up in the mirror, you know, and talk to that, you know, Mel Robbins talks about that too, you know, giving yourself a high five in the mirror as, you know, kind of woo as it sounds, you know, anything that goes forward helps you. There's that story I tell in the book about this this man who sits in the town square and he hits himself with a hammer all day. And they ask him, like, why are you hitting yourself with a hammer all day? And he says, well, because it feels so good when I stop. Right?
Yeah.
It's the same kind of. So when you start doing something in a positive direction, you're automatically not going in the negative direction anymore. And it's keeping that going, in light of the fact that the alarm is going to scream at your thoughts to try and pull you back into that same old pattern that did provide you with some sort of biochemical or neurohormonal relief back when you were a child and you had no recourse and you were powerless. Now, with awareness, you can actually start connecting with that younger version of you and getting at the root cause of the problem rather than just meal plans or trying to figure stuff out or just think, oh, I can't do this. I can't do it. Or going to exercise. That's the other thing.
Yes.
Over-exercising, right? We haven't even touched on that.
Right. No, and that's a huge one.
Of course, but these things worked, otherwise we wouldn't do them. Like they do work, but they come at a cost. Gordon Neufeld, my little mentor, and not little, but my mentor in developmental psychology used to say that all the time, at what cost? Like you can do this stuff, but eventually if it's an addictive behavior, it's going to wind up digging you deeper into that groove that you already have for yourself. Like I said, we all have these grooves. For me, it's anxiety. For you, it might be eating disorders. And when we go through these, periods of really stressful points in our lives, which we all do, that's going to be the thing that we're going to fall into unless we're aware and unless we can see it from way down the road and be able to take that exit off quickly. Because like we said, the longer you stay on that road, I'll skip one today or maybe no, and you start going, oh, how many carbs is that? How many calories is that? Counting calories. One of my best friends had an eating disorder. She was 16. She's tall. She's 5'9", and she weighed 86 pounds. Yeah. And then this is the story. So then this is in my book. So she said, I didn't know how to help myself. And I woke up in the hospital. There was a nurse there. The nurse was just like reading a book, like sort of staying with her, which wasn't doing nursing duties. And she looked down at her arm and she said, there was an intravenous needle stuck in my arm. And I was like, if these people are here to help me, why can't I help myself? And she said, that was the start, then just that innocuous thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we all kind of have one of those moments, I remember exactly where I was. I was like outside for a walk. Yeah, I was outside for a walk. This was in 2018. And I was just like, I have been dealing with this for the majority of my life.
Oh, right. And
at that point, I also hadn't had a period for like 12 years because of an eating disorder. And I was like, that is like something I'm supposed to have, but it was so familiar to me to not have it that it was like, just like anything else. Like it was as like normal as having two arms. And that's what really freaked me out. I was like, this is not normal, but it feels as normal as having two arms. And I was just like, what am I doing? And that was like my turning point.
And then, so what changed at that point? Like, what is it you got home that day and just what changed?
I started eating more. Okay. And so once I started eating more, it was like hunger just like flipped on.
Right.
And I just didn't have any like issues eating more. Like it helped because the hunger was there.
Yeah.
So there was like a little bit of fear kind of like coupled with eating more. But because I was so hungry, I was just like eating so much.
Right.
And at that exact same time, I was doing SE work, parts work. And so doing all of that together and just kind of being at this point of like, I do not want to be dealing with this anymore. Actually, there was one other thing, was I was cleaning out some old books in a closet and going through like old journals.
Okay.
And journal after journal after journal that I was opening. So it was like, journals when I was 10, journals when I was 15, and then early 20s. So spanning years of my life, and every single entry that I opened was me talking about my body and like how like I didn't feel good in my body and like so uncomfortable, just like bad body image days. And I was like, how many days have I wasted of my life being so concerned about how I look? And that was so sad to me.
Yeah, and I think that I could sort of answer that as well with I think because I wasted so many days, as a doctor. I was a hypochondriac and a doctor.
Yeah.
So that was the thing. Like, if you're a regular hypochondriac, you worry about cancer or whatever. Like I would worry about lupus or, like I had really fancy diseases that I was worried about because I knew all of it, right? So that was the thing is that the worrying did do something for me, right? So it's hard not to go back. So what do you say to people that say, hey, Meg, yeah, you had it pretty easy. You just decided you were going to eat more. What is it? What is it for me? What can I do for me? And I would say to that person, it's like, it's really about when you were saying, I was doing SE, I was doing IFS. It's a really multifaceted thing. You can't just go to say, I'm just going to, be aware and just eat less. It's just not going to work. The problem is not going to allow you to do that. And unfortunately, as human beings, or fortunately, whichever way it works, is that we equate security with familiarity, right? And this is from childhood, for sure. So what was secure for me was worrying, or what was familiar to me was worrying. So I had equated worrying with security. So when I would get stressed, I would go back to that. So when what I used to do with my eating disorder people, which wasn't a lot, but with my friend, I learned a lot from her.
For sure.
It was like just understanding that this has to be approached from a very, very multidisciplinary place, and then you almost come to your own conclusion, like, hey, like Angela did, I am actually going to look after myself now. It's not like there's two different parts of you. I think that when our anxiety, when our OCD, when our eating disorders are raging, there are two distinct parts of us.
Totally.
And it's like, how do we bring those two together? It's basically what we're saying.
Yes. And then also it's like when you're so underfed and malnourished, it's so hard to think properly, obviously. So that's why, that initial intervention, like you need to be eating more. And I always tell my clients, like, this is going to get so much easier once we're at this place of getting enough food in, and they all experience that, right? And as soon as we're closer to this place of eating enough food, all of a sudden it feels so much easier. And it's not because it is easier, but like they can think so much better, and they are more compassionate towards themselves when they are more close to being like properly nourished.
Yeah. And I had that with my anxiety people, because it's like, there's part of that, I put want in quotation mark. They want to worry because worry distracts them from this alarm that's stuck in their body. If they can be up in their heads with worry, it distracts them from this alarm in their body. So to try and move them away from worry freaks them out, because this has been their security blanket for so long, right? Same thing with eating. I imagine it's a similar thing with eating disorders. Controlling your intake has been your security blanket for so long. To sort of try and get rid of that increases a fear, which of course drives people back into either worries or back into their eating disorder. So it's this catch-22 that when you start doing something positive for yourself, you get, your ego just pulls you right back into that old familiar place, especially if you're going through a tough time.
Yeah. Yeah. So although you and I work with like kind of two different types of clients, pretty much, like what we're doing is obviously very similar in supporting the client and just coming back to their bodies. And instead of like suppressing or running away from this sensation inside, is tending to this sensation with like compassion, right? And learning how to really be with that sensation in a way that is tolerable. Because something else I talk a lot about with my clients is like, we don't have to be with it all at once, right?
Yeah.
That's a really important piece to it as well.
Because it's monumental. Like, it's like facing Mount Everest and going, you got to climb Mount Everest in a day. Like, it's just not possible. There's this great practice by Kathy Kane. She's a PhD, a remarkable healer, called objecting without contracting. So it's basically when you start worrying about something or getting fixated on something, it's like, can you just say, I don't like this, but I'm not going to resist it? Because when you resist something, you hold on to it tighter, actually, right? So it's basically just coming in. And I do this with my anxiety people. It's like, can you feel the alarm in your system and not rail against it, not object it, not try to push it away, not try to resist it? Because so much of what happens when we resist something is we lock ourselves in it, right? So if you can just stay there and almost physiologically, like, okay, I'm just going to breathe into this. I'm not going to, and making that conscious, aware intention that I'm not going to resist this. I'm just going to let it be there. I'm going to let it sit there. And just then you give it a chance to metabolize. Then you get a chance to change. But if every time you go into something, you resist it and you do the same thing over and over again, it never changes. So giving yourself this chance to sort of, I don't like this, but I'm just going to actually stay with it and just see where it goes. Now, sometimes if you had like emotional, physical, sexual abuse in the past, that stuff is like, you can't really stay with that too long because then you really need some real help from people who really know what they're doing. But in general, just being able to just sort of feel that urge to go, maybe I'll skip this. Maybe I won't do this. But just think, oh, you know what? I'm just going to allow that thought to be there. Okay, maybe I will. Maybe I will skip this. But just not create all the elaborate kind of, well, if I do that, then I'm falling back and I can't do this. And just allowing it to be there without, going into that road, down those streets, that some same street pattern every single time. It's like, okay, can I just sit here in the town square with this uncomfortable sensation or thought or whatever, and just let it be there?
Yeah, actually, this reminds me of one of my amazing clients. She'll probably listen to this, so she'll know I'm talking about her. But she came to me, and every single day she would purge. And we started working together, and similar to what you're saying here. So she had this sensation or this urge to purge at night, right? And I was like, what if we just like tended to that, how you would say like an alarm inside or the sensation inside, but without like the expectation to not purge. And it's like, okay, like if you do, whatever, but let's just notice what's happening inside. And she has not purged since January, ever since like that approach, right? But it's that resistance, like, oh no, I can't do this. This is bad. And then we do that anyways, right? But can we just like kind of be open to, okay, if this happens, but I'm just noticing what's happening inside. And that's when things can really change.
You give it a chance to metabolize. That's what I say with my anxiety people, is that the alarm is going to stay exactly the same way if you do exactly the same thing, which is shoot up into your head and worry. Because it's like you're trying to build something. You have all the material sitting there, and you walk over, say you're trying to build a foundation for a house. You walk over and you think, oh no, I got to read a few more books on how to make a foundation. I can't do this right now. So you're never actually going to build that foundation, because every time you walk over to do it, you go back into your head. You go back up into your worries. So it's staying with it's going to be tough work to build a foundation, but you just keep doing it. And like I said, you don't have to do it all at once. And then once you make a few strides forward, there will be, this is my big thing with anxiety. I don't know what's like with eating disorders so much, is that when people start to get better, that is the most critical time.
Yes.
Because it's because your ego, that ego drag, I call it the ego drag, and that the omnipotent figure that you created when you were younger to protect you, which basically its only job is to not allow you to do what's hurt you in the past, right? Which prevents you from growing, essentially. So when you allow that to go, you're going against that natural ego structure. Is like, okay, when we're at point A, we have to do B. And then when you say, well, no, we're not actually going to do B, and we're just going to see what happens. Then, and you do that for, a week or so, or the first few days, the ego dragon just lights right up. And it's like, no, we have to go back to this. So that's a very precarious place to be when people just stop worrying. Because one of my favorite, clients that I've worked with for years, she says to me, and she said to me this many years ago, she said, frankly, Dr. Kennedy, I get worried when I'm not worrying. Right? So it's just, and that's exactly what this ego dragon does. Like when you start creating this place where you're going, well, I'm going to go into this inner child. I'm going to actually sort of dip my toe. I'm going to see how she's doing, whatever. The ego's like, no, we can't go back there. That hurt us in the past. And when it does that, it separates you from yourself, creates more alarm. And if your groove is to be going into eating disorders, you will just go into eating disorder. If your groove is depression, you'll go into depression. So, and sometimes all four, right? So it's just, it's like, it depends on how big the stressor is. So what I do with a lot of my anxiety people is I say, look, when your mom's not doing well. She's going to die in the next few years. We have to prepare you, like mentally, make the intention that this is going to happen. And when this happens, I've got these things set up. Like I can be with myself this whole time. And especially with people who have issues with their mothers, which a lot of my eating disorder people had issues with their moms. In fact, I don't know any that I can recall off the top of my head who didn't have mom issues.
Right.
So it's kind of like, prepare yourself. Like, if something's going to come over the horizon, that you already have a plan. You're not going to contract around it. You're not going to resist it, but you're just going to allow it to be there and know and almost practice in your mind. When this happens, this is what I'm going to do.
Yes.
Almost like a fire drill.
Right. And we can approach this differently than how we have in the past.
With more resources, right?
Yes,
than we had when we were 6 years old.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I could just keep chatting with you forever. Maybe you'll just have to.
We'll do a part 2.
We'll do a part 2. Yeah. So thank you so much. You have a book.
I do.
Yes. Yeah. So let's talk about your book just a little bit here so everyone can get their hands on it.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's called AnxietyRX. It came out in October 2020 and it was self-published. It does have a lot of ideas in there that are not traditional. So far it's sold just under 90,000 copies.
Amazing.
And then the UK has taken it on for a second edition, and so is the US. So the second edition, which is considerably different, I think it's somewhere between 33 and 50% different, because I've done, 200 podcasts since the book's come out.
You've been busy.
I've been busy. and basically I've refined what I've said so much that I'm just making it easier for people to kind of digest it. The first book was kind of more of a memoir. So what the publisher said was, let's make this less of a memoir and more of a practical, like this is, if you suffer from OCD or eating disorders or depression or anxiety, let's make this broadly practical. It's about anxiety specifically, but really alarm is actually the root cause of all of these things anyway. So it's really a book about how to manage your alarm. And that's really, once you manage your alarm, the other issues just fall away. And that's basically what happened with my anxiety and to some extent, my obsessive traits and that kind of thing too, is once the alarm is dealt with, there's nothing left to feed the anxiety and it just sort of fades away in itself. So that book comes out, it's still called AnxietyRX in North America. It'll be called the Anxiety Prescription worldwide, because RX only means prescription in North America, which I found out after I published the first book. People are in Britain. Surprisingly, the UK is one of the highest purchasers of that book, and they don't even know what RX
They don't even know.
Yeah. So in the second edition in the UK, will be called the Anxiety Prescription, like
Both
right
great
there.
names.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. So I'm looking really forward. That comes out September 17th in North America, September 19th worldwide. And I'm really looking forward to putting this work into the world so other people don't ever have to suffer with the alarm that I did for so long. Because that was my thing, is I wasted so much of my life in this state of alarm, and traditional therapies just did not help me.
Yeah, I hear that. Well, maybe once the book comes out, we can have you on again. I can collect specific questions from our listeners or something like that. But in the meantime, I'll have everything linked up in the show notes. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Meg. I'm happy to talk to you anytime.
And that will do it for this week's episode of the AnxietyRX Podcast. And I will see you next week. Thanks so much for joining me.